My wife and I have never been to Santa Barbara before, and it's really a dazzling place that you have here, and it's just tremendously kind of you all to invite us to visit. We're really grateful. It's a lot of fun. Roman said I'll talk for an hour, might be a little bit less than an hour, because I do think we want to have time to have some discussion and questions. I'll talk to you. The title I gave to the talk, I think, is somewhat different than the title that's on the poster. My title for the talk is U.S. Foreign Policy After Iraq. The after might require a little explanation. I'm not implying, after does not imply that the Iraq War is now visible in our rearview mirror. It's certainly the case that the war is going to be with us for some time to come, and the consequences of this war are going to be with us for many years to come. Yet I do believe, and to put my professorial hat on, this is the evening's first major teaching point, I do believe that what to do about Iraq is not really the big question facing the country right now. I mean, it is a big question. It's a question that deserves attention. But it's not the really big question. The really big question is how we are to deal with the implications of Iraq, with the implications of a war of choice that has gone badly wrong, and in about another a week or so, will have reached its 5th anniversary as it continues. So I'm using the term after in the sense of in light of. U.S. foreign policy in light of Iraq is the topic that I'd like to reflect on very briefly. Teaching point number 2. My own judgment is that the developments of the past 5 years have really left the United States strategically adrift. That is to say that today the United States has no agreed upon, principled approach to dealing with the world in which we live. Now, we're in a presidential election year, and frankly, if our democracy were functioning appropriately, I think that the presidential campaign itself would center on a great debate about strategy, that we would hear the candidates talking about what should be the principles that should guide U.S. foreign policy in light of Iraq. But I actually fear that that's not going to happen, that the presidential campaign is going to be a missed opportunity with regard to foreign policy, and frankly, in many respects, it's going to be a missed opportunity because so much of the focus, at least in terms of foreign policy, is on what we ought to do about Iraq. Should the war continue? Should the war be terminated? Well, if you favor withdrawing U.S. combat troops, well, what are you going to do in terms of a residual presence? Should there be a train and equip mission, and so on? The campaign focuses obsessively on the war itself, the campaigns, and therefore it seems to me there's too little attention given to this larger question of, well, given that this war has not gone anything like what its architects expected or intended, then what does that mean for U.S. foreign policy more broadly as we go forward? Now, I would want to emphasize that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the Bush administration did, in fact, articulate a principled strategy for what it called the global war on terror. The Bush administration articulated a strategy that possessed logic and possessed coherence. And this was the strategy of the freedom agenda. It was logical, it was coherent, it was also wildly unrealistic, and it has proven to be totally unworkable. The strategy of the Freedom Agenda rested on three assumptions. I'm going to tick off the assumptions that were the basis of the strategy, then I'm going to go on to explain why all of these assumptions have been proven to be false. The strategy of the Freedom Agenda rested on three assumptions. The first of those assumptions was that American power, and especially American military power, is irresistible. Now, I have to say that this notion of irresistible American power, President Bush, Richard Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, they didn't invent that idea. That idea really had come to be the conventional wisdom in the aftermath of the Cold War. It really was an idea that had commanded bipartisan support. I mean, you can go Google speeches that Bill Clinton was making when he was president during the 1990s, and you can find all kinds of evidence that would sort of suggest that he too was pressing this notion of America, the sole superpower, America possessing military power such as the world had never seen. So I'm not trying to suggest to you that Bush and the current administration invented this idea, but they embraced this idea, and the idea was crucial to the strategy that they concocted in the aftermath of 9/11. The second assumption was, I think, peculiar to the Bush administration, or perhaps peculiar to the Bush administration along with that group of people that we generally call neoconservatives. The second assumption was that the greater Middle East is malleable. Indeed, that the greater Middle East is ripe for transformation. Greater Middle East being a term that the Bush administration devised. It's a flexible term, but one that generally encompasses the region of the world stretching from North Africa, across the Middle East, into Central Asia, to Pakistan, to Indonesia, to the southern Philippines, where something on the order of 1.2 or 1.3 billion Muslims live. So the second assumption was that the greater Middle East is malleable and is ripe for transformation. The third assumption, and this is the one where probably we would most give credit to the neoconservatives in terms of bringing it to the fore, but again, to be fair, the neoconservatives didn't invent this notion. They were really recycling something that has deep roots in American political thought. The third assumption was that democracy provides the necessary antidote to the pathologies that afflict this Islamic world. And along with that the United States of America possesses a particular knack for exporting democracy. Now, here in 2008, in Santa Barbara, California, there may be some who believe that the Freedom Agenda from the outset was cynical and contrived. I myself don't think so. Can't prove it, but I myself think that for President Bush himself, 9/11 was a moment comparable to the moment that St. Paul experienced on his way to Damascus. I mean, he was struck down, and the scales fell from his eyes, and the president who, prior to September 11th, had tended to style himself in kind of a soft way as a realist, somebody who had promised, you'll recall, when he was running for the presidency in 2000 and said we'd have a humble foreign policy. Well, he was struck down on September 11th, and when he rose up again, he was a born-again Wilsonian who believed, genuinely, I am persuaded, genuinely believed, that history intends that democracy will triumph around the world, and then Providence intends that the United States will be the chief instrument in making this happen. I mean, he's a religious man, and this was a quasi-religious transformation. I wouldn't argue to you that people like Vice President Cheney or former Secretary Rumsfeld fully bought into that Wilsonian concept. Rather, my take would be that individuals like that probably were willing to go along with the president's with his freedom agenda, with the expectation that even if freedom didn't take as a consequence, that American power would result in the creation of something like hegemony across this greater Middle East. And that as far as people like Cheney and Rumsfeld were concerned, hegemony would be a satisfactory fallback if it turned out the democratic transformation was impossible. So in that sense, we might say that there were some in the administration who were genuinely committed to the freedom agenda. There were others who were willing to endorse the freedom agenda because they saw an obvious fallback position. Regardless, more importantly, events over the past 5 years have clearly demolished all three of those assumptions that I laid out for you, and therefore we're left with a freedom agenda in tatters. And let me make the case, go back through the three assumptions again. Well, the first is, it turns out American power is far more limited, far too limited, required if the object of the exercise is either to liberate the greater Middle East, as Bush intended, or to pacify the greater Middle East, as Cheney and Rumsfeld intended. Most importantly, the form of power that we generally, I don't mean necessarily you or me, but we, the American people, certainly our political leaders, the type of power that we believed was really our strong suit, military power, has turned out to be far more limited than we anticipated. You know, going into Afghanistan in the end of 2001 and then going into Iraq in March of 2003, both of those operations initially displayed in a remarkable way the panoply of technologies and techniques that came briefly to be called shock and awe. I mean, this whole notion that U.S. military forces would be able to exploit, use, integrate the benefits of information technology in ways that would make armed force far more efficient and effective than the world had ever seen before. Going into Afghanistan and going into Iraq, shock and awe looked pretty good for a while. Unfortunately, what has long since become apparent, both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, is that this high-tech form of warfare really provides an inadequate response to people's war, or guerrilla war, or unconventional war, or whatever label you choose to put on it. Matter of fact, what we find is that these unconventional forms of war exhaust our capacity to employ force. Preventive war, the Bush Doctrine, Preventive war, the chief means by which the Bush administration intended to advance the freedom agenda. Turns out that preventive war doesn't work. I mean, set aside, just for the sake of argument, any moral objection that you have to preventive war, and just think about it in pragmatic terms. For preventive war to be effective, you've got to be able to use force and achieve a very quick, unmistakable, economical knockout blow right away. Turns out that doesn't work. Hadn't worked in Iraq, hadn't worked in Afghanistan. Most troubling, I think, still talking about the limits on American power and especially American military power, most troubling, at least it ought to be troubling for those who still think that the freedom agenda is a good idea and ought to be workable, most troubling is that we find as a nation that we have no easy way to expand our force so that it would be adequate to the tasks that we have assigned the force. I mean, the big problem in American military policy today can be expressed very simply. We have too much war for too few warriors. We've got a country, total population is now over 300 million. We've got an active duty military that's about 1.5 million, 0.5% of the population. It's not that there are not sufficient numbers of able-bodied young people who couldn't pick up an M4 in a rucksack. It's that we have no way, I say we in this sense, the federal government has no way actually to convert those citizens into soldiers, because military service, of course, has long since been, since the end of the Vietnam War, has been something that is completely voluntary. The longer Iraq and Afghanistan go on, and the more they look like unwinnable stalemates, the more difficult it is to persuade young people that they ought to pick up an M4 or a rucksack. So the force that we have, the force which now has soldiers going back for their third or fourth combat tours, has proven astonishingly durable. But it's not big enough to do what the freedom agenda requires that it do. The second assumption had to do with the greater Middle East being ripe for transformation. Well, wrong again. Turns out that the greater Middle East, in fact, is not all that malleable at all. We have to remember that the Iraq War was conceived in a strategic context. It was conceived as the start of something. Success there was expected to lead to success elsewhere in bringing about democratization or pacification. Iraq was supposed to be a way station. Instead, Iraq has turned out to be a strategic cul-de-sac. Paul Wolfowitz, who, of course, was the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the first term, had predicted that Iraq would be what he called the first Arab democracy. And the key word there was first. That after the first would come the second and would come the third. Clearly, this has not happened. And indeed, I'd say that based on the progress towards democratic transformation that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, you'd have to be a pretty pretty wild-eyed optimist to think that the prospects of transforming the greater Middle East are all that promising. And then there's the great irony, of course. The great irony is that where the seeds of democracy have actually germinated, they haven't produced the crop that we expected. We had free and fair elections in Gaza on the West Bank, and they brought Hamas to power. We had something like free and fair elections in Lebanon, and they enhanced the political authority and standing of Hezbollah. What should we learn from all this? It seems to me what we should learn is that the sort of casual references to the achievements of post-1945 in Germany and Japan, which did bring about a democratic transformation in those two countries, there's no reason why we should think that those examples are somehow directly applicable to a different part of the world that has a different culture at a completely different time in world history. So my point of all this is to say that the United States finds itself in 2008, and the United States has no coherent strategy. As a substitute for strategy, in its twilight days, the Bush administration has actually begun to revert to policies that it once disdained. The focus really is no longer on transforming the greater Middle East. The focus now is on preventing the greater Middle East from falling apart. And I'll give you 3 examples of what I mean. The first, although the Bush administration is not sort of keen to broadcast this from the roof of the tallest building in Santa Barbara, the first is that we are now talking to the members of the axis of evil, at least the 2 remaining members of the axis of evil. Bush administration has for some time now been engaged in an effort to negotiate with North Korea regarding the North Korean nuclear program. And albeit at a more junior level, not involving people like Condoleezza Rice, U.S. officials are engaged in conversations with Iran. Second example of the Bush administration reverting to policies that it once disdained is that any efforts to transform other nations in the region politically have now been put on the shelf in preference for stability. Immediately after the publication roughly of the 2002 National Security Strategy, much talk by people like Condoleezza Rice of putting pressure on President Mubarak to bring about liberal reform in Egypt. Much talk about putting pressure on the royal family in Saudi Arabia to bring about the liberalization of that oppressed, closed, corrupt system. That talk's gone away. The efforts have been suspended. For all practical purposes, the Bush administration, with regard to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, has reverted to the policies towards Egypt and Saudi Arabia that have been pursued by the last half-dozen administrations. Third example of the Bush administration reverting to a policy that it once disdained is the recommitment of the United States to playing an active role in the so-called peace process. The whole point of the meeting that was conducted in Annapolis late in 2007 was to suggest that, not to suggest, explicitly committed the Bush administration to bringing about a peace between Israel and the Palestinians before this administration ends in January of 2009. So regardless of who wins in November of 2008, what does all this suggest with regard to the situation that the new president will inherit? Well, it suggests several things. And the first and most important is that the new president will take office and will inherit a strategic vacuum, no strategy, and will also inherit a host of problems. The new president will inherit ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in neither place is it likely that we're going to have a favorable outcome anytime in the near future. There has been much talk of late about things turning around in Iraq. We're told that the surge is working. I think if you choose the right data points, you can convince yourself of that. It's certainly true that the level of violence in Baghdad has decreased over the past 6-8 months. It's certainly true, and we should be grateful, very grateful, that the number of U.S. casualties has declined. But I think what's gotten insufficient attention is exactly why have these positive trends occurred. And my guess is that the most important reason why these positive trends have occurred is because we're now paying off Sunni insurgents in order to set down their arms. And they've agreed to do that because it serves their interests in the near term, not because these former Sunni insurgents have come in around to the American program for the future of Iraq, and not because they're willing to accept Shia majority rule. Basically, we're paying off the Crips so that they won't attack the Bloods. And that might work for a while. Basically, it seems to me that the achievement of the surge has been to take a situation where in the latter part of 2006 we were flat out losing and Iraq was headed for chaos, and we've now restored a situation which really is stalemate and holds out the prospect of us being in Iraq if John McCain gets elected for 100 years. Then there's Afghanistan. You know, the operational code name that the Bush administration devised for the war in Afghanistan was Operation Enduring Freedom. Six and a half years after 9/11, it's become Operation Enduring Obligation. Afghanistan, like Iraq, I mean, we need to see things as they are. They are not sovereign countries. They are dependencies of the United States. Neither the government in Kabul or the government of Baghdad would be likely to survive our departure. We can't know for sure. Cost of those wars is something in the order of about, what, $3 billion a week? New president's going to inherit that. New president, barring something truly miraculous, and it's the Holy Land, so that's a possibility, the new president is going to inherit a situation in which there is no resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Even if President Bush and Condoleezza Rice really mean what they say about being determined to secure a peace by the end of this year. And I think one of the things that we as Americans tend not to pay much attention to, but which could be the most dangerous of the problems the new president's going to inherit is Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan is the one place on the face of the earth that combines in one country a substantial Islamic radical presence, activism, ambition, B, very weak, almost illegitimate political institutions, and C, nuclear weapons. And Pakistan is a very, very dangerous place from our point of view. In addition to all these problems, no strategy, lots of problems, the new president is also going to inherit a host of constraints that we should be wary of or we're mindful of. The first of those constraints takes me back to the military. Ground forces are badly overstretched. And it seems quite unlikely that the U.S. Army and the U.S. military could repeat the surge even if the next commander-in-chief wanted to repeat the surge. The new commander-in-chief may also inherit some kind of an Iraq syndrome, more or less a counterpart to the Vietnam syndrome that existed for a decade or a decade and a half after the Vietnam War, meaning that there'll be a real aversion in the public that will be reflected in an aversion within the Congress to any further use of force. Now, one could argue that might be a good thing, but if you were the commander-in-chief, it's a constraint that you're going to have to deal with. It seems increasingly obvious that the next president is also going to inherit serious economic problems. I mean, we could go into great detail here about growing level of the national debt as a percentage of GDP, fall in the savings rate, structural deficits in the federal budget. But I'd cite two things that are notable. One of them is that the new president's likely going to face a situation where the new benchmark for oil is going to be $100 a barrel. And the second thing is that the new president's going to inherit a situation in which the value of our currency continues to weaken and continues to fall. I mean, for somebody of my generation, if there are any Canadians in the audience, I apologize for this, but for somebody of my generation, it is astonishing that the greenback today is worth less than the loonie. You know, that's just not supposed to happen, the way the universe was constructed. But it's indicative of trends that ought to concern us and will certainly be problems that will be on the new president's desk. The new president's also going to find, I think, that those to whom we formerly looked for assistance in trying to achieve our national security objectives aren't ready to answer the call any longer. Again, at least if you're in my generation, you tended to think that the acronym NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, signifies a militarily potent and cohesive alliance. Well, it did 20 or so years ago, and it doesn't today. And if you've been following some of the debate, the transatlantic debate about Afghanistan, you'll have noticed the way that Secretary of Defense Gates has been trying to put some pressure on our European allies to send more troops to Afghanistan, and also to remove the restrictions on the troops that they already have in Afghanistan so they could function more effectively. And basically, he's gotten stiffed. I mean, he's gotten stiffed, I think, for two reasons. Number one, they really don't have the troops. They don't have trained and equipped and deployable forces in substantial numbers. And secondly, the publics in places like Germany don't have the stomach for this, don't want to participate. So to the extent that we think that the remedy to our problems is to be found in the employment of military power, increasingly it's going to have to be our military power that we rely on, and increasingly, of course, we find that our military power is not sufficient. New president's going to have to deal with that. Now, given all that, given the fact that the old strategy has fallen apart, given the fact that there's lots of problems, given the fact that there's lots of constraints, will it be possible for the next president to develop a coherent strategy to replace the failed strategy of the freedom agenda? And the answer, of course, is yes, there has to be. It has to be possible. Well, what might that strategy look like? There's two ways to answer this question. I'm going to give you an answer that fits in one context, but I want to acknowledge that there's a completely different context. The answer to the question, what should be What principles should inform U.S. strategy could be addressed given the assumption that the threat posed by violent Islamic radicalism really will define the 21st century, and that therefore dealing with that problem, addressing that problem, ought to shape the way we think about the way we relate to the world. But it's possible to say, to argue, to answer the question, what should be the principles informing our strategy, by saying, the threat posed by violent Islamic radicalism is real, but it's not existential. It's not going to be the force which shapes the 21st century. There are actually other concerns, threats to our well-being, which are actually more important and should take a priority above dealing with the threat posed by violent Islamic radicalism. If you go down that path, you come up with a strategy that is radically different from the strategy you come up with if you go down the path that assumes that Islamic radicalism is the most dangerous concern that we have to address. So you can address this thing two ways. I'm going to propose to you what I think would be the outline of a strategy if you assume that the threat posed by violent Islamic radicalism is the most important thing we have to deal with in the century in which we have now embarked. I'd say that a strategy relative to the global war on terror could be based on 5 principles. 3 of these principles are general, 2 principles are fairly specific. I'll give you these and then we'll wrap up and then we can have questions and discussion. First principle. Rather than squandering American power, husband it. Acknowledge that the key lesson that Iraq has shown, Afghanistan as well, but chiefly Iraq, acknowledge the lesson that American military strength is finite. We really have a great army, and we should preserve that army rather than allowing it to be wasted away in support of a misguided policy. But it's not just that our military resources are limited. So too are our economic reserves, so too is our diplomatic clout, which really has withered over the course of the last 5 years. All of these need replenishment. And the place to begin replenishing our power, it seems to me, is to rethink the use of force. The next president should abrogate the Bush doctrine of preventive war. We should never again embark upon a war in anticipation of some nation potentially becoming a threat somewhere down the road. We shouldn't do it because it's immoral. We shouldn't do it because, again, pragmatically, what we've learned is it doesn't work. I mean, in my judgment, given the events that have unfolded in Iraq over the last 5 years, one would have to be truly demented to think that a preventive war against Iran makes sense. Again, I'm setting aside all moral considerations just for the sake of argument. But in light of Iraq, to think that preventive war against Iran makes sense is truly a reckless proposition. So the next president, it seems to me, should abrogate the Bush doctrine of preventive war, and we ought to revert to policies with regard to the use of force that are more in line with the just war tradition, which sees war as a last resort. and sees war as justifiable only for defensive purposes. The just war tradition gives us a way to think about war that is primarily concerned with seeing things in a moral framework, but the more I've thought about it, it seems to me that the moral framework also makes sense pragmatically. Principle number 2 for this new strategy. We need to align ends with means. If our means are limited, then so ought to our objectives be. You know, President Bush's penchant for Wilsonian rhetoric certainly thrills neoconservatives, but it raises expectations that cannot be met. We can't transform the greater Middle East. And we should commit ourselves to and promise to achieve only those things which can be achieved. Principle number 3 of this strategy. Not general, more specific. We need to let Islam be Islam. We don't possess the capacity to liberate 1.4 billion Muslims, and we don't possess the wisdom to liberate 1.4 billion Muslims who just might entertain their own ideas about what freedom actually means. My next statement is based on absolutely zero empirical knowledge, but I believe it to be true. I believe that much as over the course of some centuries, difficult centuries, Christianity found ways to accommodate itself to modernity, so too Islam will find some way to accommodate itself to modernity. The only thing is, Muslims are going to have to figure out that solution on their own. And quite frankly, if you think about it, back in our Western tradition, back at the time of the Reformation, when Catholics and Protestants began clawing at each other and trying to resolve their differences, I think people in the West, Europe, would have found it rather odd if leaders from the Muslim world would have presumed to instruct Christians as to how to resolve their differences, how to update Christianity. It would be equally presumptuous, it seems to me, of us to try to instruct Muslims as to how they're going to make their own accommodation with modernity. It's their problem, it's their business. Let Islam be Islam, rather than presuming that we can impose some set of ideas or values on Muslims. Fourth principle, related directly to the third. I also suspect that this process of negotiating that accommodation to modernity is going to produce unwelcome fallout, unwelcome from our point of view. It already has. As Muslims try to figure out where Islam fits in the modern world, it's going to produce anger, it's going to produce alienation, it's going to produce scapegoating, it has produced violence. Some of it's going to target us. Now, as a historian, we could have long, interesting arguments about who should be blamed. How do we distribute the blame for the complicated relations between the Islamic world and the West? It's an interesting argument. I'm not sure it's one that has any particular policy relevance. The policy issue is that in collaboration with our allies, the United States needs to find ways to insulate itself from Islamic radicalism, to insulate itself from the violence that is being exported. And that's why the fourth principle is we need to reinvent containment. The imperative is not to wage a global war against terror or to wage a global war against violent Islamic radicals. The imperative is to erect effective defenses so that violent Islamic radicals cannot hurt us. That's what we did, that's what the West did during the Cold War, when we perceived the threat to be international communism. What we need to do is to rethink containment and find new ways to apply that idea to a threat that is quite different. So when I say reinvent containment, I'm not trying to suggest, well, then we need to have a new NATO that sees its target not as the Kremlin, but sees its target as Tehran. No, we don't need a new NATO. We need to think our way through how to protect ourselves, how to restrain any expansionist impulse coming out of the Islamic world, and to ensure that we can continue to try to live safely and securely. Fifth principle, we need to exemplify the ideals that we profess. It seems to me, maybe this strays beyond national security strategy, I suppose it does, but it seems to me that we really are at the point where rather than telling others how to live, which has been our specialty since the end of the Cold War, we really should devote ourselves to repairing our own institutions, which are badly in disrepair. Above all, it seems to me, we need to begin to try to repair our democratic institutions, which have come to be deeply enfeebled. And in some respects, even the ongoing political campaign that we've seen this year exemplifies that. So those 5 principles, it seems to me, rather than squandering American power, husband it, align ends with means, let Islam be Islam, reinvent containment, exemplify the ideals we profess, could potentially, arguably, provide the basis for devising a principled approach to strategy to replace the freedom agenda. My real point of sort of going through that litany is not to say that this is the right answer, that I've got the right answer, but rather to suggest that these are the sorts of arguments that we ought to insist that we get from our candidates. Don't tell me how many brigades a month you're going to pull out of Iraq, but tell me how you're going to devise a principled approach to the world in light of everything that has happened to Iraq. That's what we're not hearing enough of, I think. So with that, I think that I will stop, and we're just shy of an hour, and I look forward to any questions or comments that any of you may have. And again, on behalf of my wife and myself, we're very grateful for the opportunity to come here. Thank you. He was first, so.
Okay. Given at least 935 lies to Congress, the American people, and the world leading us into the war, given the kidnapping and torture that's been going on.
You're not going to ask a question. You want to make a statement.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. How about impeachment of Bush and Cheney as a means of cleaning house?
So that was a question?
Yes.
Okay. It's not going to happen.
As a process, then, to tell the world that, yes, America does care,
well,
that atrocity has happened and needs to be cleaned up.
I think that it's possible that the election itself could, see how it turns out, deliver the message that you, and probably I as well, would like to see delivered, but I just don't see impeachment at this stage of the game as something that is politically plausible. And so, I mean, I respect you or anybody else who wants that to be your cause. I just don't think it's going to happen. It's not going to happen because the Democrats at this stage of the game would not calculate that it would be to the advantage of the Democratic Party. That would be my view. Yes, sir.
Cynical and contrived, the democratization of Islam. Paul O'Neill, I think in the first National Security meeting, made the comment that the first item on the agenda is how do we get rid of Saddam Hussein, not why. And I'm of the school that behavior's cost. It doesn't just happen. So the Democratic agenda, it seemed to me, was a fallback position, that he first tried to get traction with the idea of getting rid of a dictator, a man who gassed Kurds and invaded Kuwait, etc. Finding that there was no traction there, who could be against democratizing the world? Would you think that notion is reasonable, plausible?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, let us be clear that historians are going to be arguing for decades about what motivation or what mix of motivations really explains this. One would not dismiss the testimonial of Paul O'Neill. One would also not say, aha, here's the one guy who really understood exactly why people what they were thinking and why they wanted to do. I would begin with the assumption that major policy moves are unlikely to reflect a single motive. Major policy, in major policy moves, it's unlikely that all of the major players in administration actually agree. That there will be a mix of motives, that a Wolfowitz will look at why to invade Iraq and have a different idea of purpose and outcome than a Rumsfeld or a Cheney might. The reason I cling to the freedom agenda as being genuine is I think all of these people, not all of them, not the president, but Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush, Powell, even as a dissenter, Rice, did see wanted to frame their response to 9/11 in grand strategic terms. They wanted to achieve any number of things. But above all, I think what they wanted to achieve was preventing another 9/11 or something worse than 9/11, and also trying to ensure that the region of the world which was crucially important to the developed economies of the world because of the presence of oil and natural gas, they wanted to ensure that that was stable and to ensure that the West had access to it. Those are the two things. We don't want another 9/11, we want oil. And I mean we want oil because the president came from Texas and he was in the business of trying to funnel profits to oil companies, but because this economy functions on access to cheap, available energy. That's what they wanted to do. And the freedom agenda was the way to do that. To use American power to bring about change, to bring about either democratization so that they wouldn't, quote unquote, hate us any longer, or to bring about pacification, meaning dominance and control, so that even if they hated us, they'd have a more difficult time getting at us. That was the grand strategic vision. Now, is it possible to argue that some in the administration viewed Saddam as unfinished business? You know, damn it, we should have got him back in '91, and we've been itching to do. I dare say that was part of it. Is it possible that the president himself, as I think he suggested at one point, wanted to get Saddam Hussein because of the attempted assassination of the elder President Bush in 1993? Sure, may have been a factor. But it seems to me, which I can't prove, that the most likely dominant purpose was to try to bring about this change in the region so that 9/11 wouldn't happen again, and so that we would be able to continue to tap oil in order to fuel our economy. Can't prove it, you know. I'm perfectly glad to listen to alternative views. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor, for your clear sort of setting forth of principles to think about beyond the immediate situation that we're in today. I think that part of the shortcomings in terms of public discourse these days is just to think about the immediate issues and rather than try to think down the line in the long term. So I really appreciate the systematic way in which you've attempted to
I feel a butt coming.
No. But yes. You raised the issue of modernity and Islam, and I thought I wanted to problematize that a little bit in terms of how modern is the United States if we are so weak in terms of developing a knowledge power as opposed to a military power. That is, a facility to use languages that are used in other countries and really promote that within our own country rather than trying to move to develop the latest weapons system to create that, you know, a defense against any potential threats. If you look at China or India, you know, almost any of the other major countries in the world, the people with knowledge there are developing a capacity to understand and communicate in languages that are not their own native language. And I think there's a real shortcoming in our own culture, but I'd like to hear your response.
I would agree with you entirely. I mean, you're looking at the classic example of the problem. I mean, when I was a military officer, I lived for 7 years in Germany. I speak minimal German. I counted on them to speak English, and they did, and I was too lazy to learn German. It's a crime. So you're exactly right. We need to do better on that.
How do we do that?
I'm going to tell all the young people to get serious about learning a second language. My sense is actually that there's a greater awareness of that among the young people that I teach. I think at BU, I think at other places, there's increasing emphasis on the need to do just that. I know at BU, I believe in other places, there's increasing emphasis on I think it's become just about an imperative for a young American going to college to spend at least one semester abroad. I think at BU we're trying to suggest to people that it may be a lot of fun to go to London or Sydney. It actually may make more sense to go to some place where culturally you're obliged to go outside your comfort zone. So I think you have correctly, in my judgment, you have correctly identified a problem. I would like to say that we're on our way to solving that problem. We're not, but I think there's a recognition of the problem that you describe and at least the beginnings of some effort to do that. You know, it's remarkable. See, I mean, I myself, we are a remarkably parochial people. Whenever we live on the East Coast, think about this every time I fly across the country. You know, we were talking about that on the plane. We can fly to London faster than we can fly to the West Coast. And you fly across this country of ours and you look down and it is big. I mean, we are our own world. And it becomes quite easy to simply accept that this world that we inhabit is the world. I don't know how you overcome that, because I think that's almost hardwired into the American psyche. But I think your comment is a good one.
The other part of my question on modernity and Islam is that oftentimes U.S. policy has ended up backing up highly Islamist either governments or organizations, partly as a result, I think, of the Cold War. So we have the incident in Iran where they actually had a democratically elected government in 1953, which we overthrew, and then that was replaced with a monarchy, which then led to the Iranian Revolution that we have now.
Yeah, you're
and there are other
simplifying
cases
a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, and the same thing with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which gave birth to the Taliban. So again, a sort of considering modernity and Islam, we can see that there are efforts made in the Muslim world that have arisen, partly inspired by the West, to move forward with democratization and things like that.
But again, nothing I suggested was either trying to whitewash the errors we've made in the past. I think very much what I was trying to suggest is that our interventionism in this world tends to be misguided because we don't understand the world, and that's why I go back to one of the principles I was suggesting for people's consideration is let's let them figure out how they're going to make this transition.
Thank you. It's very painful to be at this microphone because 2 weeks ago we were talking about Gaza and trying to prevent violence, and we failed, and there's been just horrible events in Jerusalem. I don't think there's anyone who's not grieved by what's been going on. The only way we're going to have peace for our children and our grandchildren is if we all become highly educated. I'm going to invite your comments on two areas. One is we need to understand Islam. It's not that much different than Christianity and Judaism. It's the God of Abraham, peace be upon him. And, you know, they're not that different. So let's start using this kind of general term, Islam. It's just, you know, Islam's very diverse. There's 1 billion people, and they're all different. And let's identify the ones that we can work with in a peaceful world, okay? So I resent the use by, I question the use by the previous speaker of this term Islamicist as though it means maniacal. Let's get serious and be smart. But what you've already kind of expressed on that topic, so I'd like to invite you, really, this is a very nice town, a lot of really smart, good people here. And we all want the same things. We want peace, and so we're not going to have peace if we don't learn how to dialogue on a peaceful solution to the problem in Israel, Palestine. Now, there's a lot of good people who are Israelis who are getting outmaneuvered by very extreme settler factions who are grabbing territory and sinking foundations on land that was supposed to go to the Palestinians.
What do you think we ought to do?
Well, I was going to invite the Baceivch opinion. Personally, what I think we ought to do is we ought to pressure Israel to recognize the civil authority in Gaza and sit down at the table.
How would you do that?
I would tell Olmert, we're going to cut your funding 10% this year and 10% next year if you don't negotiate.
What do you think he'd say?
You know, there's people in Israel who are trying to push forward sanity and rationalism.
What do you think he'd say?
Originally, in the beginning, there'll be a lot of resistance from Olmert, but I think that eventually that there more moderate people in Israel will realize, hey, you know, we can't say, 3 for us and 1 for you, and crowd these poor people in Gaza indefinitely and cut their power. Come on, you kind of have a little compassion. Judaism is a compassionate religion. There are people in Israel who want peace.
My turn.
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. It would be I absolutely share the view that if anybody could find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem, it would be an enormously useful advance. And I mean that in particular, I think, looking at things from the point of view of U.S. self-interest. It's really a debilitating problem where I disagree with you. And this is what makes it, frankly, if all we had to do was to threaten to cut their aid by 10%, it would have been done long ago and we'd have this thing fixed. Now, my sense is that I'm an American Catholic. I'm not an Israeli Jew. But my reading of the history of Israel is that among its core beliefs is that We must count on ourselves to defend ourselves, because the history of Judaism is that at the end they will abandon us, they will betray us. And quite frankly, if we called them up tomorrow and we said, unless you do what we're telling you to do, we're going to start cutting off aid, their response to me, at least subconsciously, would be, right, this is what always happens. This is what always happens to the Jews. And they would reject that. And they will fight for their land, and they will defend it to the end. And we must keep in mind that they've got something on the order of 200 nuclear weapons. And that fact alone ought to cause us to be somewhat cautious about making threats or trying to coerce them to doing things that are not in their interests. Now, ultimately, it is in their interests to find an end to this terrible problem, but it's not clear to me that it's quite as simple as some people would want it to be. Again, if it were, it would have been fixed long ago. Yes, sir.
I'd like to get a little bit more specific and see how you feel we might react to another 9/11 type of incident without violating the principles that you have laid down.
Can you describe the scenario that you have in mind?
Well, there's so many. They're horrible to conceive. Release of nuclear materials into a major city, the spread of disease, and so on. But something that we can clearly trace back to, for example, Al-Qaeda.
Okay.
How can we react to that?
The strategy of containment, in my mind, does not necessarily imply a completely passive response. Erecting effective defenses chiefly means intensifying our intelligence collection efforts and adding additional resources to police efforts, improving border controls, denying Al-Qaeda access to financial resources. It ought to include an effective energy policy, although that seems so unlikely. But it would also include, from time to time, as necessary, military action against specific terrorist targets. So if Al-Qaeda manages, let's say the Taliban, I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon, but let's say the Taliban regains power in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan, once it becomes a terrorist haven, meaning that there's Al-Qaeda training camps and operations, then we should use U.S. military power, mostly probably air power, in order to take out selective targets so that they don't have the opportunity to devise these plots. And if there is a plot, and if God forbid the plot is successful, then we should go get the people who were the plotters. I mean, one of the really obscene things about the circumstance in which we find ourselves is that all these years after 9/11, Osama bin Laden is still at large. That's utterly and completely unacceptable. So when I say containment, I don't mean we just sit in our hands. And it does seem to me that where there are people who are in fact engaged in activities that threaten us, then self-defense includes the ability to take them out. I distinguish that case from the case of Iraq, where Saddam Hussein did not have any ability to threaten our security. Is that okay for an answer?
I'd like to ask you a question of strategic versus moral values. And I'd like to preface this with the following. You're a historian, and you know much better than I, but From where I stand, peace in the world has only been achieved in a few ways. One is overwhelming fear of retaliation, as in the Cold War. The other is in overwhelming annihilation of your enemy, as in World War II. The third is in separation and isolation, which to some extent we see in the former Czechoslovakia, breaking up of a country into individual fiefdoms. And to some extent, we see that possibly happening in Iraq with the Kurds, the Shiites, and the Sunnis. But the question I really have for you is that the world is quite different than it was back when Neville Chamberlain wanted to have peace in his time by appeasement. And the consequences of that, of course, were quite horrific in the ignorance of what happened in the Soviet Union, of the murder of tens of millions of people by Stalin. We were ignorant, yet it happened. The problem is we're not very ignorant anymore. We have knowledge, which perhaps we'd rather not have. We see what happens in Darfur. And for us to say, let them do as they will, it's their problem, not ours, actually I think is very difficult for many people because there is a moral, not just a strategic question. And I'd like to get your feelings on that, because inaction, which I realize you're not suggesting, but inaction will lead to that. It will lead to mass murder and genocide. And so how do you address those in the context of wanting to disengage to some extent?
Well, I would not agree with you in describing containment as disengagement. I don't think that the containment policy that was applied in the Cold War in any sense implied disengagement. Containment determined the terms of engagement. But to get to your question, it seems to me that there are some types of behavior that morally are simply unacceptable, that to accept them causes us to, we find ourselves living in a world that just becomes an abomination. The inaction of the Clinton administration at the time of the Rwanda genocide would fit in that classification of episodes. We ought to have acted, we did not. I'm not sure that I see as many of those episodes as perhaps you do. Whether or not Darfur qualifies as an episode that we should act, I think the case can be made either way. I personally could be persuaded either way. But I guess the thing I would emphasize is that even in those circumstances, it seems to me that we ought to understand the limits of what we are able to do. Had we intervened in Rwanda, I don't think that we would have brought peace in any particular sense. We could have stopped the killing. Perhaps, not perhaps, definitely, we ought to have stopped the killing. But apart from stopping killing, it's not clear to me exactly what kind of political purposes we can achieve. There it seems to me that one could take the Somalia case as instructive. I would say that of all the U.S. military interventions since the end of the Cold War, and they are numerous at this point, Somalia in late 1991, when it was ordered by the elder President Bush, was the only one where I think you could make the argument that the U.S. acted for humanitarian reasons as opposed to some kind of strategic or political calculus. We need to remember what happened. The purpose of the mission in going into Somalia was to try to create conditions so that international relief agencies could provide relief to starving Somalis. And we did that. And then the Clinton administration came in, and I think chiefly responding to the concerns of Madeleine Albright, at that time the UN ambassador, Albright said, well, now that we've stopped people from starving, if we simply withdraw, then the conditions that were producing starvation will be restored. So what we need to do is we need to put in place some new political order so that this failed state, Somalia, won't be a failed state. That there'll be some kind of governance, provide order so that people can have a decent way of life. I think morally that's an admirable line of reasoning. But the result of doing it, of course, was to trigger a war. Triggered a war against the Somali warlords, particularly Muhammad Farah Aidid, who were content to have the Americans and the UN come in so long as all the Americans were going to do was to pass out food, but were adamantly opposed to the notion that the Americans or the UN would determine the future of Somalia. So we ended up with a war. The war went very badly. Lost 18 Rangers. U.S. was humiliated. One of the results of that humiliation was to persuade Osama bin Laden that the Americans were paper tigers. I don't say any of that to somehow indict Albright or indict Clinton, but simply to say that these interventions don't necessarily, I think seldom, will produce peace, and frequently will produce unintended consequences that we will pay for dearly down the road. So that leads me to be one who is not somebody adamantly opposed to any intervention, but cautious about intervention.
My brother landed in C-130 there, and I really wish you would study peace, sir. I just think it's way too involved in this war with Saudi Arabia. My brother was a combat military, okay? They drag Americans through the streets, and my brother put his life on the line. And I don't like what you're saying.
Next question. Two more questions.
Assuming that Islamic fundamentalism isn't the greatest threat that is facing us in the next 100 years, what would be the fundamental strategies that the next president should be considering? Because you posited two theories.
Right. One of my favorite writers was Reinhold Niebuhr, the Protestant theologian, public intellectual, wrote mostly back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I can't remember in which of his books, I think it's Irony of American History, but he says at one point that what he says the art of statesmanship. Niebuhr was a realist. I'm a realist. Meaning, we don't really believe in peace. I mean, we hope for peace. We don't expect peace. And Niebuhr and realists would say, we need to accept the fact. It's just the way it is. Don't have to like it. Nations act in pursuit of self-interest. Nations cannot be self-sacrificing. Nations cannot be altruistic. I mean, they can do altruistic things on the margins, but the essence of international politics is a competition for power. That's just the way it is. That's what Niebuhr believes. That's also what I believe. And so Niebuhr, this realist, said that the art of statesmanship is to identify points of concurrence. That was his phrase. Points of concurrence between the self-interest and the larger interest. In other words, the idea is not for the president to get up in the morning and say, what good things can I do for the world today? No, he or she should get up in the morning and say, what are the things that I need to do for the United States today that also happen to correspond to what others want to do? And at that point of concurrence lies opportunity to actually get things done. So the second approach to strategy says, if violent Islamic radicalism, which I do believe is real, but if it's not an existential threat that should determine our policies, what might some of those points of concurrence be? Things that, as we look into the 21st century, really ought to scare us. And I think without a lot of difficulty, we can think of at least two things. I can think of at least two things. And one of them is nuclear weapons. Now, as a realist, I could make an argument that you may or may not buy that nuclear weapons were politically purposeful during the Cold War as instruments, as a part of a strategy of deterrence, as part of this strategy of containment. But as a realist, in 2008, I would say that nuclear weapons have no practical utility and are utterly unnecessary even to deter the use of nuclear weapons. Now, first of all, the gentleman who has this, the nightmare scenario, if the terrorists get nuclear weapons, God forbid, our nuclear weapons are not going to deter them. There are states that have nuclear weapons. We probably do want to have the ability to deter them. We don't need nuclear weapons to do that. Advances in conventional weapons, which are actually useful, and therefore, or I should say usable, and therefore can be more credible, actually probably can provide all the deterrence we need. So we're signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which pledges nuclear states to work for universal nuclear disarmament. We've always ignored that. So have the other nuclear states. I mean, so have the Brits, so have the French, so have the Chinese, right? I think we have a profound interest, self-interest, in working toward the abolition of nuclear weapons. That the world will be better for us. But oh, by the way, arguably, it'll be better for everybody else too. That doesn't mean that the president should issue another proclamation. It means we should unilaterally disarm. U.S. nuclear arsenal today is much smaller than it was during the Cold War, but it's still somewhere above 5,000 warheads. What if the president tomorrow said, over the next 5 years, we're going to reduce that to 200 warheads, unilaterally? We don't care. That's what we're going to do. And then use that as leverage, both to try to oblige others to follow suit, and also to try to raise as high as possible the taboo against using nuclear weapons that has existed ever since we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So I think that could be a point of concurrence and could be a useful pillar to begin to base a strategy on. And the second thing I think is equally obvious, and that's climate change. Now, there's still some people who question whether climate change is real. I'm not a scientist, but I mean, it seems to me that there now is a pretty strong scientific consensus that it is real, that it's caused by human activity, it's promoted by greenhouse gases. And so to save our way of life, we're going to have to begin to change our way of life. And that we could take the leadership on this. And again, there'd be a point of concurrence with others. So things like that, that doesn't mean you ignore other more conventional security considerations. It doesn't mean you pretend there's no terrorist threat. But it means that in terms of the way you prioritize things, that these other things kind of become the organizing principle. And in that sense, what we call the global war on terror, which shouldn't be a war at all, becomes perhaps a second-order priority. Now, nobody making that argument is going to get elected president, because we the American people, have generally bought into the notion that the terrorist threat is an existential one, the global war on terror is the best way to think about our policies, and it's going to go on forever. Last question.
Speaking of getting elected president, this is a leading question since I know your answer, but I wonder if you would share with us which of the three candidates you think is most likely to adopt your realist agenda, and which one would be most likely to appoint you Secretary of State or Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Well, I don't think any of them will, but we were talking about this earlier, and I'm not only, this will probably horrify people in Santa Barbara, I'm not only a realist, but I'm also, I view myself as a conservative. And I think that there is a strong conservative case to be made for voting for Obama. And the case is not to say that Obama is like a closeted conservative. He's a liberal Democrat. The conservative case for voting for Obama is as follows. Obama is the anti-war candidate. If the American people elect Obama, the American people will, in effect, be rejecting the Iraq War. We'll be declaring the Iraq War a failure, misguided notion. We don't want to do that again. And that, it seems to me, will perhaps open a little bit of space for a real debate about U.S. foreign policy. And it's a space in which people of my persuasion will stand up and say, oh, realism, you know, modesty, let Islam be Islam. Whether those ideas will have any chance of persuading anybody would remain to be seen. There will be other people who will be standing up. There will be people who are saying, you know, we should work for world peace and this is the way we should do it. My point is, I think with an Obama presidency, there might be a chance for a genuine foreign policy debate. If McCain or Senator Clinton are elected, there will not be any foreign policy debate. Because President McCain would definitely keep going down the same path. And I think by and large, President Clinton would also go down that same path. That's just my reading. I could be totally wrong. This has really been a treat and great questions, very challenging. Thank you very much. I'm grateful.